In 1813, Charles Barnard, an American sea captain from New York, found himself stranded with four sailors, some of them fellow Americans, some British, on the remote Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. They had almost no supplies, just a small boat, a blanket, some seal hunting clubs, and a few tools. Making matters more difficult was the fact that the United States and Great Britain were in the middle of the War of 1812, disrupting commerce on the high seas and posing the risk of imprisonment for sailors of both nations. By the time he was finally rescued at the end of 1814, Charles had been in the Falklands, devoid of any permanent human settlement and buffeted by everything from breakers to hailstorms, for over 500 days. It would still be another 2 years before he could return to his family in New York. Just as fascinating as the tale of his miraculous survival, however, is how he and his companions found themselves as castaways in the first place. It is a story that involves strange coincidence and episodes of human charity, all marred by patterns of the grossest betrayal and cruelty. To help us tell that story, I'm joined today by Eric Jay Dolin, the author of numerous books of maritime history and other topics that touch on everything from whaling to piracy and the fur trade. Eric's new book, Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World, unpacks the story of the Falklands castaways in unprecedented depth based on his own original research and his background in ecology. You can find his book in the description below. It is a story that you will not soon forget. Eric, thanks so much for being here today. I'm happy to have you.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So, as we get into this story, I kind of would love for you to tell us, how did Charles Barnard end up being stranded alone with four companions in 1813? It's kind of a crazy story, and one that we're going to unpack a bit today. But would you mind laying out in broad terms how these poor guys end up alone with a small boat?
Sure. As you mentioned, it is a complicated story, but I will try to make it as simple as possible. Essentially, there was a sealing vessel called the Nanina, which left from New York Harbor in the late spring summer of 1812. They went down to the Falklands to engage in sealing, which is essentially stripping fur seals and sea lions of their pelts and ultimately hoping to sell them in China, where there was a good market for them. They also would kill sea elephants and render their blubber into fine burning oil, which was almost as good as spermaceti oil. So you've got this sealing vessel with 13 men on board going down. They get to the Falklands on September 7th. They are alone on the Falklands. There is nobody else there. They continue sealing until the beginning of 1813, when they suddenly find out that the War of 1812 has broken out. So they decide to stay in the Falklands and continue sealing. A few months later, in April, they discover smoke on an island about 100 miles away from where the Nanina is located. They have a smaller vessel that they take to go on sealing voyages. So they investigate this and they discover the wreck of the Isabella. It's a British brig that came from New South Wales, which we know is Australia right now. And it had 54 passengers on board. It wrecked on Eagle Island. All 54 passengers survived. The Americans encountered them. The passengers, the castaways, are thrilled because these might be their saviors. So the Americans do the humanitarian thing. They agree to save the castaways, stop their sealing voyage, bring those castaways to South America, or possibly even the United States so they can get back to England. And in return, all they ask for, since they're halting their sealing voyage, all they ask for in return is to be able to be compensated with whatever they can take from the wreck of the Isabella, as well as any of the cargo, excepting any personal cargo that the 54 passengers have brought with them. So that deal is set in place. Despite the fact that there's a war, the British essentially agreed to it with a few holdouts. And what Charles Barnard, the captain of the sealing vessel, has to do is he has to take his smaller shallop, which is this sort of this vessel that they take to go around the islands. He needs to take it back to where the Nanina is holed up and get the Nanina in shape to leave the Falkland Islands. So he sails back to where the Nanina is, and he takes with him a number of British naval Marines, who are some of the passengers, and other British passengers. Everything's going fine, but then the bad weather sets in and there are a lot of delays. And what happens, unbeknownst to Charles Barnard, is that some of the British, there's a couple of nasty individuals among the British are scheming to basically, they don't want to delay going back to Eagle Island and getting off of the Falklands. And who knows what else they had in place, because there's another element that we'll probably get to later that nobody knows about, and that's the arrival of a British warship. So anyway, they're scheming to get back to Eagle Island. And Charles Barnard realizes that this group of probably 35 to 40 people is fast running out of food, and they need more food. So he takes a hunting group of 5 people, including himself and one other American and 3 British crew members of the Isabella, to a neighboring island to kill hogs and birds and bring them back to the people who are putting the Nanina in shape so it could sail off from the Falklands. So because they're fast running out of food. While he's away, the British rise up and say, we're going back to Eagle Island. The father of Charles Barnard is actually one of the sealers, Valentine. And he says, no, no, let's wait for my son and the other men to get back. They'll be back just in a day or two. The British will have none of it. They want to proceed. They don't know how to navigate the ship. So one of the Americans who knows how to navigate says, fine, I'll navigate you back to Eagle Island, but we have to stop at Beaver Island and we have to pick up the hunting crew and not leave them behind. They agree. The British agree. But then when the Nanina is abreast of Beaver Island, they don't really stop. All they do, they don't anchor, they don't go on land, they don't look for the hunting crew. They just fire off a few guns and then they zip off. So the Americans are very distraught, but the crew of 5 people, including Charles Barnard, is essentially left behind on Beaver Island. And then there's a whole very complicated story about how they realize that they've been stranded and they're absolutely dumbstruck. And then they try as best they could in this small whaleboat, probably a 24 or 25-foot boat, open boat, to navigate to Eagle Island to catch up with the people before they leave the Falklands. But it's a very complicated story.
And we're going to get into it,
and they don't make it.
And so Eric has just very skillfully described an extremely complicated story that he goes to in great length, and we're going to unpack some of those deeper details because I'm sure some of y'all are scrambling to remember what quite's going on. The book is full of great maps and pictures to actually help put you there, and I'll include some pictures in the video. But just before we dive into those weeds to understand, why are these Australian British people here in the first place? For a lot of people, what is sealing really?
Right.
And then some of the other, it just condensing so much information there. There's some wild stories of how they even get a relief ship to show up in the first place. But before we get into all that, I kind of just want to ask you, Eric, you've written about a lot of stories in maritime history and other stories generally. How did you come upon this topic? How did you get into these weeds?
Yeah.
And maybe some of the research process, because from what I can tell, did you spent time in the Falklands?
No, I didn't. I'll tell you, there's a funny story about that.
Okay.
But let's do that
Yeah, how
last.
did you get into
Uh,
the topic?
Basically, a lot of my books, the topics come from the work I'm doing on a current book. Something sparked my interest. That was not the case with this book. I really wanted to write a book that was focused on an individual event, a few years. A lot of my books focus on decades or centuries. So I wanted to try my hand at a more focused story. And there's a book that I've used before, not to get any ideas, but this time it worked. There's a book I used that was published about 50 years ago that was basically a chronological listing. And there are many books like this, many of which were published in the 1800s, but this one was published in the 1970s. And it was a chronological listing of shipwrecks and disasters from 1580 to 1860. And essentially, all it was is for each disaster, there would be a paragraph. And then beneath it, the author would list the primary documents that tell the story. So I was reading through it and I said, oh, there have been books written on that topic, on that topic. Oh, I wrote about that one or this. And then finally, I came upon this one paragraph that essentially just talked about Charles Barnard and these five men being stranded on the Falkland Islands for 18 months. It didn't tell much more than that, but it did say that there was a book that Charles Barnard wrote in 1829 about his adventure. So I said, okay, I'm going to read that book. So I read that book. Then I started searching newspapers, and I found a lot of contemporary newspapers that covered the event. And what was probably most important is there were logs of some of the ships that were involved. And then there was a subsequent court case. So in the British archives, which I was able to access, I've been there a number of times. This time I didn't have to go to England because their system, digitization system, is so good. I was able to order the documents I wanted, but there were a lot of court documents that recounted what had happened, as well as formal complaints on the part of some of the Americans who came back before the Charles Barnard and the other people that were stranded. So there was enough information to write a book. And that's when I said, okay, this is the book that I want to write.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's something that really comes out of the story, and you have good notes to kind of indicate where things are coming from. And obviously, Charles's account, that's a godsend for a historian, or for
Yes.
anyone writing a historical book. But you really do a lot of original research when it comes to some of the specific follow-ups of the court cases, getting multiple
Right.
perspectives on what's going on. And
Right.
as we get into this, you guys will see that there's a lot of people who are really not trustworthy in this story. And they'll say, obviously, one thing to, the Royal Navy inquiry about what's going on.
Right.
And on the ground, they're actually, monsters, for
Yeah.
instance. But so that's interesting. And I want to then kind of move into the Falklands themselves, because if you're reading this book or really understanding the story, so much of it is dealing with the specific layout of the Falklands, the challenges of being there, why people are there in the first place. If listeners have heard of the Falklands today, it might be just because of the Falklands War in the 80s between Britain and
Right.
Argentina. Um, and they weren't exactly a holiday destination in the 1800s or even,
No,
well,
not at
maybe
all.
today. But so if you could just give us like a quick overview of just a brief look at what the early history of the Falklands was like, why it's maybe a
Right.
contentious area,
Right.
and then what's up with the seals? We'll get to
Yeah.
that. But
Well, the Falklands is an archipelago about 300 miles east of the Strait of Magellan off the tip of South America. That's comprised of about 700 islands. If you count the islands that remain visible during high tide, it's probably only about 200 islands, but it's a very treacherous area to navigate through. And it's long been a bone of contention between the French, the Spanish, and the British. And there were in the 1700s at various times, there was a French settlement, there was a British settlement, and there was a Spanish settlement. But by the time of the War of 1812, essentially the British, everybody had left. There were no other people on the island. The British still claimed it as theirs, and the Spanish claimed it as theirs. And therein lies the seed of that ultimately ended up in the war, the Falklands War in the early 1980s. So it's a very long, convoluted history. It's hard to determine who was the first European to discover the Falkland Islands. It's a little easier to discover who are the first to settle there, but there's a lot of political machinations. And I want to go back to the question you had before, just briefly. I did not visit the Falkland Islands. And, I have this saying that I've used before. And it's sort of silly, but, I wrote a book about whaling. I've never harpooned a whale. I wrote a book about the fur trade. I've never trapped a beaver. I wrote a book about China. I've never been to China. And I wrote this book about the Falkland Islands. And actually, one of the reviewers is a guy named Menson Bound, who is the guy who recently came out with a book. He's the one who discovered the Endurance, Shackleton's Endurance, which was a big news item recently. And he grew up on the island where Barnard spent a lot of time during his stranding. So one of the best compliments I got is not only did he write a nice blurb, he also said, I captured the islands very, very well. And the islands, the Falkland Islands, are like a character in the book. And I'll add one other funny thing. I worked with a number of people in the Falklands to get information, to get images, and they kept saying, you need to come visit. And so I told them, I said, okay, if my book becomes a big bestseller and I make a boatload of money, I'm coming to visit because it's not easy to get to the Falklands and it's
No.
pretty expensive. So hopefully I sell enough copies so I go to the Falklands because I would love to go there. But the Falklands is a very difficult environment, especially back in the early 1800s. During the summer months, the average temperature is 49 degrees. During the winter months, the average temperature is about 36 degrees. But the average wind speed on the Falklands, they're very windy, is about 18 miles per hour. So when you consider wind chill, an average temperature of 36 degrees probably goes down to the upper 20s. And there are no trees, there are no breaks in the wind. There are these grasses called tussock grass, which can grow to be about 8 or 9 feet tall, and they can provide some shelter, but it's a very exposed, cold, damp environment. And a lot of people described it as dreary and depressing. Some people said it was gorgeous and beautiful. I think it's strikingly, beautiful, especially from a natural history perspective, because it has all these seals. It's got fur seals, it's got sea lions, it's got sea elephants, it's got a lot of very interesting birds, it's got some interesting plants, it's got whales offshore and a lot of fish. But the main reason that the sealers were there is in their name. There was a sealing industry that was connected to China primarily that started before the United States broke free from England. There were some countries that were killing seals and sending them to China, even in the mid to early 1700s. But after the American Revolution, the Americans got involved in the sealing trade a little bit after they got involved in the sea otter skin trade, which was also to China. So the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were many, many American sealing vessels that were going not only to the Falklands, but other islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic and even the Indian Ocean to kill fur seals, which were the most valuable pelts because they were the plushest, to kill sea lions, which were called hair seals, which were less valuable but could be used to make coats and shoes and boots. And then they would also kill these sea elephants. So that's what brought these sealers to the Falkland Islands, because it had been a destination for these kinds of vessels for a couple of decades, and they hoped to load up with thousands and thousands of dried seal skins, put them in the hold of the ship, and then sail around Cape Horn and go all the way to Canton, China, which is today Guangzhou, China, and sell these pelts for as much as $5 a piece. And that's not nearly as much as you could sell a sea otter pelt for, which could go for $50 or maybe even $100. But when you consider they're probably on the order of 2.5 million to maybe 3.5 million or more seals were slaughtered, that's a pretty substantial business.
It is, and it's interesting because you hear about whaling. Obviously, Moby Dick puts a lot of romanticism in whaling, and
Right,
there's for the beaver trade and other fur trades on land. There's the mountain men and the stories of the frontier. There's a lot of romance there. There's very
right,
little romance in the sealing world, and I think if most people have heard of sealing, it's in Canada today, seal
right.
clubbing and that sort of thing, and
Yes,
and just, reader be warned, like this, it's a gritty historical tale of like what people are actually doing for
right,
a living. And
right.
there's a lot of seal clubbing going on, which will
Yes,
actually save some of them in the long run.
yeah.
Uh, some of the men, not the seals.
Yeah,
But
but I want to point out just for
yeah,
the squeamish. I mean, as you know, in the author's note, I go to great pains to say I am writing history. At this time, sealing was considered a respectable industry. There were no environmentalists, there were no ecologists, really. There was no conservation movement. Nobody was crying or getting upset about the killing of seals or whales or beavers for that matter. So I'm telling history, but I also do point out that the United States for a long time has banned sealing, and most other countries have done it as well. And there are just a few countries that still have a seal hunt, but it's relatively small. So even if you hate the concept of people killing seals, this is history. In order to understand how seal populations are faring today, this is part of the history that will tell you the difficult times they went through, just like the whaling history will tell you a lot about the populations as they exist today and why the right whale is almost extinct and why blue whales are just making a comeback. So I'm hoping that people don't get turned off by the book just because there are sections in it where they talk about clubbing seals and killing them.
Right, and you definitely shouldn't, and that's not the main action of what's happening, but it is the
Right.
reason that some of them are there.
Right.
And it's not upsetting in any kind of way, and there's actually some very lovely stories in there that I'm not going to give away totally, but
Right.
there's a dog, for instance, who's
Oh
sort of
yeah,
this
great
beloved
dog.
character and helps. He's good at fighting hogs.
Yes.
And there's also a penguin massacre by a deranged man who
Yes.
is frowned upon by everyone. So there's all sides
Yes.
in there. Now,
Yeah.
with that background, the sort of sealing trade, especially the same people who are doing whaling from New England, because they have the ships and the infrastructure, they're also doing sealing.
Right.
Um, and so it's not unusual for sealers to be in the Falklands necessarily, but it is unusual for them to be there when they're there in the War of 1812, which, as you said,
Yes.
the island's basically empty. We're talking about hundreds of miles of archipelago, and there's basically going to be a total of two ships there. Uh, and
Well,
so,
ultimately three ships, but
correct.
two ships. But you're right. And just to talk about the War of 1812, just for a quick minute, the sealing enterprise, the Nanina, knew that there was an embargo coming because war was on the horizon. And the owners of the vessel and the captain decided we better get out before the embargo. They placed an embargo to give people enough time to come back from sea, 60 days, 90 days before war is declared. But these people decided they're risk takers. They decided to leave New York Harbor before the embargo was imposed. They stayed off of Sandy Hook, New Jersey, along with 70 other ships that had the same idea, not to go sealing, but to go on all sorts of different types of trips. And then they went to the Falklands. The war hadn't broken out yet. Their agreement, what they signed with the owners, is if the war broke out, they were supposed to go back to the United States. But they decided it would be best to stay in the Falklands in the hope that the war would be over within a year and just stay there and gather more seal pelts rather than try to go back and potentially be captured by a British ship and end up in a British prison.
Right. And one of the main ways the War of 1812 started was over the impressment of sailors as like a
Right.
background conflict to the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and other tensions with Native Americans. But as you're saying, a lot of the War of 1812 is a naval conflict
Yes.
between British and American ships. And obviously, American ships are outnumbered and outgunned in that general environment. And so, like you're saying, they're taking risks. There's some funny characters on the Nanina. Um, Charles, his father Valentine. Charles, he's an interesting character in that at times early in the trip he seems to be a temperamental jerk,
Oh
basically.
yeah. Yes.
But then later in the story, he is like the epitome of like charity and wise
Right.
leader. At least that's how he presents
Right.
himself,
That's
maybe.
yes. And I have to be honest. It would be nice to have had another account of another man who was with them, but none of them contradicted him when he wrote his book. I mean, some of them are still around, I assume. And there were some other indications that I believe that he was as accurate as possible. He perhaps left out a couple of things that made him look bad. I don't know what they are, but you can only work with what you have. But even before that, he was a jerk. He was hot-headed and very violent. But when he was confronted with it, then he changed his ways even while he was with the men he was sealing with. And for a number of months, he acted in a fine manner and nobody complained about him anymore. And you have to also consider that once he was stranded, he's in a totally different situation. He's not a captain of a ship. Captains of ships were not nice people. They were used to giving orders and having them be obeyed. And a lot of them were, not the most pleasant individuals. And then adding to the mix is the fact that on the Nanina, because so many mariners were out of work because of the lead up to the War of 1812 and all this impressment, there were 5 men on the Nanina out of 13 people on that ship who had formerly been captains of other vessels, sealing vessels and whaling vessels. So you almost have a situation in which there's going to be a volatile environment because you got five guys that are used to being in charge and they need to answer to one of them. So it did create a very interesting dynamic.
It did. And to your point about him being the only source, but seemingly being reliable, he does include a number of details that are less favorable to him.
Yes,
In one
yes,
scene, for instance, he's fighting a hog and he ends up accidentally striking his favorite dog at the same
right,
time, which, if he was just painting a rosy picture, definitely probably would include that bit. And
right.
so there is a fun transformation. And as I mentioned in the intro and as the book shows, this guy's on the Falklands for over what, 500 days total, him as a
534 days.
yeah, that's a lot of time to be
Yes.
alone and to think and to change. And so the Nanina shows up, they're conducting sealing operations. There's a lot of crazy tensions there that you should read about. But at the same time, the Isabella, as you said, is coming from New South Wales, which was the Australian or the British penal colony of convicts in
Mhm.
what is now Australia.
Right.
And they are really just a bunch of miserable people in a lot of respect. There are some good characters there. Uh, but so how are they? What are the kinds of people on the Isabella, and what happens when a storm crashes them into, I
Yeah.
think it's the Eastern Falklands?
Right. Okay, the Isabella had 54 people on board, in addition to the number of people that were crew. It was essentially a ship that was leaving from Port Jackson, Sydney Harbor to go back to London. And there was sort of a motley assemblage of people. There was cargo on board, there was whale oil, there were seal pelts, there was mother of pearl, which is used to make buttons. But then there were 14 Royal Marines who were being sent back to rotation. There was a captain of the Marines, a guy named Robert Dury. There were some former captains of other ships on board, some other military people. There were 10 former convicts who either had done their whole sentence or been pardoned. Four of them were almost certainly former prostitutes. There were a couple of unsavory guys there who their shadowy backgrounds, and during the story, they revealed themselves to be pretty miserable individuals. So you had this big group, and then you had this Captain Higton, who was a drunk and a lascivious guy who shacked up with one of the prostitutes and basically shirked his responsibility. They almost crashed off of Campbell Island, southeast of Tasmania before they even made it to Cape Horn. And then they made it around Cape Horn, but they weren't supposed to be anywhere near the Falkland Islands. Poor navigation and other circumstances led to them being near the Falklands. And then when disaster was about to strike, Hickton had been warned a number of times, but he refused to come up to the main deck. He was three sheets to the wind down below, drinking and carousing and playing cards and doing other stuff. So another captain on board, a former captain of a ship, actually one of the penal colony transports, he comes up, but he's a little bit too late, and they crash into a reef on Eagle Island in the eastern part of the Falklands. And luckily, they crash close to shore, and all 54 of them are able to make it to shore. They establish this little community they call New Providence, and for they immediately decide they're going to send out a rescue mission. They elect six of their own to go on a 17 and a half foot longboat, which had been on board the Isabella and wasn't destroyed in the wreck. And they were able to pull from the wreck. And they modified it a little bit. And six people were going to sail throughout the Falklands looking for the British or Spanish that they thought might be there, but they weren't. And then if they didn't find anybody, they were going to sail 1,100 miles to Montevideo or Buenos Aires. And they ultimately ended up sailing to Buenos Aires, a very interesting voyage, which I recount. And when they got to Buenos Aires, they talked to the British commander on post. And he was associated with Captain Bligh, the famous mutiny of on the Bounty, the Bounty mutiny. So that's an interesting part of the story. He sends a rescue mission, a British warship, the HMS Nancy, with the Captain Duranda, down to rescue the castaways. He knows nothing of the sealing vessel, the American sealing vessel, because that all happened after the 17 and a half foot long boat left, but before the British were discovered. So it's all these different threads coming together. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the story is when the British warship arrives, it's got these Americans there. It's got the castaways. It's got the agreement that was reached between the Americans and the British, where the Americans were going to save them. But Duranda decides to rip that agreement to shreds and essentially capture the Nanina as a prize of war and take all the men on the Nanina as prisoners. And then what leads us to the stranding is, even though they were there for a couple of months and they had plenty of opportunity to go rescue the hunting party, they basically didn't. It was a half-hearted attempt, and then they didn't do anything. So they intentionally marooned these 5 men and left them to their fate. And I think that is one of the worst things. And one of the worst things is that the British, even though a lot of them were sort of miserable individuals, a lot of them, you have to question, basic human nature. Basically, they have a captain of a warship coming down saying, I'm going to take this ship as a prize because I have the potential to make some money here and other considerations. None of the British stood up for the Americans really at that time, despite the agreement they had reached. Some of them, in their later accounts, they bemoaned the fact and they said, oh, the Americans were treated horribly. We shouldn't have done this. This is really bad. But none of them had the spine at the time to say to Captain Duranda that you can't do this to the Americans. They were going to help us. Even though it's a time of war, these are different circumstances. Not a single person, until they got back to South America, and some of the commanders of the British Navy looked at the circumstances and started to say, this is not quite right. This shouldn't have happened. And then there's a legal case that takes place in London, which is a fascinating ending to that part of the story.
And I mean, there's so much heartbreak at the middle of the book because
Yeah.
on the one hand, there are, a lot of people rise to the occasion in the short term. Charles kind of reforms himself, becomes a super likable guy. And basically, you've got 13 American sealers who are really out there to make money, to make a living, is what they're trying to do.
Mhm.
And they're confronted with a boat full of 58 ex-convicts and Marines of
Right.
a nation they're at war with. And
Right.
they're going to volunteer to change everything, put them on the, which they're worried about because,
It's a lot of
as you
people.
see, it's a lot of people and a lot of them have guns. And
Yes.
if they want to do something different, they can mutiny. And
Right.
so and then even Haywood, the guys in the boat make this insane, insane journey in an open boat over
Yeah.
thousands of miles, somehow make it. The guy they bump into, everyone they bump into is happy to help them.
Right.
And then this jerk is in charge of a ship named the Nancy, which
Yes.
is just a funny plot point throughout the book. And so, as you mentioned, he wants the prize money, and so he ultimately shows up and basically, rug pulls the Americans, as
Right.
you're saying. And so, with that whole setting, everyone is taken away. There's this. We'll describe a little bit. You covered it. As they're halfway through trying to rescue the British, they're doing this in stages because you can only move so many people on the little boat, the shallop, to the
Right.
big boat, the Nanina.
Right.
And Charles is out going hunting with some British people, which
Yeah.
is a real.
Three
And so,
Brits.
describe how that little mini mutiny occurs.
Well, he goes off to Beaver Island, which is right next to New Island, where the Nanina is, to kill hogs and birds and bring them back to the people so they have enough food to eat. There are 3 British individuals, they're crewmen on the Isabella, and 2 Americans, Charles Barnard and Jacob Green, one of the 6 black men that was on board the Nanina. So they're off thinking that they're doing this humanitarian thing, getting food. And in the meantime, a guy named William Mattinson, who has a shadowy past and is a nasty individual and already had threatened Barnard with essentially taking over the Nina as a British prize, he, along with the support of the Marines and the captain of the Marines, decides we're just going back to Eagle Island. What they were going to do at Eagle Island, it's not 100% clear. It's possible that they might have decided to just take over the Nanina and leave the Americans there or take them as a prize or prisoners. But then the warship showed up and that changed all the dynamics. But whatever they had in mind, they didn't care about the hunting party. And what is really ironic and becomes readily apparent when the men are finally marooned is that one of the British sailors who is in the hunting party, a guy named Samuel Ansell, he was in on the planning among the British to basically commandeer the Nanina and bring it back to Eagle Island. And he bemoans the fact that he volunteered for this hunting party because he didn't think that his co-conspirators would leave while he was away. That wasn't part of the plan. I mean, Charles Barnard came up with the idea of going hunting on his own, but they had been fomenting this plan before. It just so happens that the timing turned out that they decided to execute the plan while these five guys were on another island. So it's all these circumstances. I mean, 100 things could have happened differently in this story, but they didn't. And you have to think about human nature. What would you do in that situation if you were castaways? It was a time of war. A British warship, a warship from your country came, and they had dozens of soldiers on board that were armed, and a captain that was intent on taking the Nanina as a prize and making the Americans prisoners. Would you, as just passengers on a merchant ship that was going back to London, even though a couple of them were military, would you have the guts to stand up to this captain? And if you did, would it have changed anything? I don't know. It's one of those what ifs. And there are a lot of what ifs in this where people could have made different choices. For example, one of the most interesting things in the book to me was the attempt on the part of the five men on the island, the hunting party, to get back to Eagle Island before the British, before anybody left. And for weeks and weeks, they tried and they made some wrong turns. They nearly died. But if they had pushed on, if they had been more successful, if they had gone the right route initially, as opposed to making a tragic wrong turn and going on a big loop that was way out of their way, they might have made it back to Eagle Island in time before the British left, before they took the Nanina and the British warship left. And if that had happened, who knows what would have happened? My guess is they would have just made the Americans prisoners and taken them back to South America. But it would have made the story less interesting because there wouldn't have been five men stranded for 18 months. And if that hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't have written the book.
And that's true because there's like two and a half good story arcs within the book. And the book reads very clean and quickly. And so you're covering a lot of ground, but it's not laboriously done. And at the end, and I kind of just want to touch on this sort of last episode before we sort of close out our discussion. Um, Charles goes with these guys, and as you said, Allred's with them, and or Olson, or what was his name?
Ansel?
Ansel. And
Ansel.
he is a monster of a human being. He
Yeah.
also has a redemption arc that, well, I'll leave to readers to
Yeah.
find. But the height of betrayal is, the four guys abandon him. They take the dog
Right.
with them, which
Yeah.
which Charles loves. And then
Yes.
Charles decides to go Rambo mode and just do it himself. And that
Yeah.
amazed me. One, it's what makes his story so fascinating is how he
Yeah.
is the center, the anchor of that plot, before they come begging back for mercy because he's got all
Right.
the food.
Right.
But I thought at that moment, if I was in that situation, which I can't even imagine, but I would want to lay down and die at that point,
Yeah. Yeah.
but he's going to make it for almost 100 days. So,
Yeah.
if you could just sum up some of the challenges that he faces and some of his friends face in that last Castaway segment.
Well, when they left him, they took his dog, which is the main way to hunt hogs. It's hard to catch a hog if you're a human being alone because they're very fast and they have very sharp tusks. So scent, the dog played an important role and also was an incredibly important companion. Anybody who has a dog knows how important that relationship is. So that's one thing. They also took almost everything else from him. So it was very cruel. They took his flints to starting fires. And there was a fire going when they left. So he kept the fire going, but he had to basically figure out how he was going to maintain this fire that enabled him to cook the albatross and penguin eggs and any birds he was able to catch and also keep himself warm. And he was lucky in that effect because he did find some stones that could be, he had one knife with him and he was able to hit the heel of the knife or the blade, hit back of the blade and create a spark. So he found a flint-like stone, and then he discovered not long after that that the peat, which is the accumulated detritus from these large tussock grass plants, that peat, like in the moors of England, you dig it up, it burned almost like coal. So he all of a sudden had an inexhaustible source of fuel and heat, and that helped him a lot. But he was a pretty tough guy, no matter what you think of him. And he didn't seem to me to be the kind of guy that would lay down and die. And I imagine that even the weakest willed individual in that situation would fight to live. The will to live is pretty strong. But he is somebody who had been on sealing voyages before. He had been to the Falklands before. He had lived a pretty rough life. So he knew how to do a lot of things. And it wasn't like somebody like a landlubber suddenly being dropped on the Falkland Islands and say, survive. So he had some skills, and adding to that, he had a clear determination to make it.
He did, and he he makes a story, and really, there's we can only cover so much, or only want to, because I want to leave a lot to be read. But there's this, it's a heartbreaking relationship. His father is forced to leave him. There's this ambiguity, and really, the story even goes beyond where the realities of sea travel in this period. Instead of getting, whenever he's finally rescued, instead of getting to go straight back to New England, he has to go to Hawaii and
Right.
Peru,
China,
and it takes him
China.
over like 2 years to get home. And
Yes.
so it's a fascinating story and well told. And I advise everybody to pick up a copy and other of Eric's books, which will be linked in the description below. Uh, but for now, everybody, thanks for stopping by. Happy to see you next time. And Eric, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.